At the end of the day, we're dealing with patients' lives. So I think it all starts with a high moral integrity and moral fiber. And I think that is culturally something that is critically important at C2N Diagnostics. So this moral fiber permeates throughout all elements of the organization. At the end of the day, the truth always reveals itself with enough time. We take the responsibility of what we're doing very seriously, and we ultimately have to communicate that. And we know that as a company that really has been at the forefront of this whole field of blood biomarkers, if we don't do it right, we really risk causing concerns for the rest of the industry, but we embrace it.
Have you ever noticed that some of the best ideas come from unexpected places? Your next breakthrough may come from a leader facing similar challenges, but in a completely different sector. Welcome to Chief Influencer. I'm your host, Anthony Shop. Join us as we explore how today's successful leaders inspire, influence, and connect with others. Chief Influencer is a production of Social Driver and the Communications Board, who have teamed up to spotlight how great leaders and communicators are making their impact in the world. This episode is brought to you by the George Washington University's College of Professional Studies. With in-person and online programs ranging from master's degrees in public relations strategy to certificate programs in digital communications, GW offers more than just the credentials to help working professionals get ahead. It prepares them to be leaders in their field. As a proud GW graduate myself, I can attest that faculty members combine academic rigor with real-world lessons that can't always be found in textbooks. Check out cps.gwu.edu for more information. I'm so excited to introduce today's guest, Dr. Joel Braunstein, the CEO and co-founder of C2N, a company focused on developing and commercializing diagnostics for Alzheimer's disease and other related forms of neurodegeneration. Here are 3 things I think you should know about Dr. Joel Braunstein. Number 1, he has over 20 years of experience in the healthcare industry, including playing a senior executive role in numerous emerging life sciences companies. Number 2, prior to his business endeavors, Joel was a fellow in cardiovascular medicine and Robert Wood Johnson Clinical Scholar at Johns Hopkins, trained in internal medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital at Harvard Medical School, and received his MBA from Johns Hopkins Carey School of Business. That is a lot of schooling, which we'll hear about. And number 3, Dr. Braunstein was named a distinguished alumnus of Johns Hopkins University and received his MD with highest distinction from Northwestern University Medical School. So Joel, you've been called a lot of things, from doctor to chief executive, distinguished alumnus to innovator. Today, we are thrilled to call you a chief influencer. Welcome.
Anthony, thanks so much for inviting me to participate in this discussion and exciting podcast. It's a real honor, and I'm humbled to have the opportunity to be with you today.
Well, I've been really looking forward to this because the company is fascinating, but like many of us, I have a personal connection, family members who have suffered from Alzheimer's disease. And so I'm really excited to hear about the pioneering work that you're doing in more detail. I understand that an investor recently reminded you that a lot has changed since C2N was founded almost 2 decades ago. And I wonder if you could tell us why your work is more relevant now than it has ever been.
Great. No, it's a great question. And it's obviously a topic I enjoy discussing, the history of C2N Diagnostics. This particular investor, as I was speaking with him recently, he said, you were committed to Alzheimer's disease when Alzheimer's was boring. And what that shows is a relentless pursuit and commitment to trying to make a difference, even if that difference takes a long time to implement. And I think that it's one of the underlying threads of people who are committed to making a difference in this space, the scientists, the researchers, individuals within different organizations that have been committed, not just 5, 10, 15 years, but 20, 30, 40 years to really try to address some of the underlying challenges of Alzheimer's disease. And C2N is part of that history. So, of course, it's exciting because while it wasn't always easy over the last 18, 19 years, we can look back on that time as a pivotal time to learn about the underlying causes of Alzheimer's disease and then thinking about how might we approach it from a treatment perspective, and then ultimately also diagnose at the earliest stages so that we can then apply the therapies that are now starting to emerge today. And I think we're at an absolutely transformational time in Alzheimer's disease. Historically, in when people, colleagues, friends, family knows about what I'm doing, they come to me and they talk about personal stories of how maybe a loved one was suffering from dementia, but how often we hear about the fact that that dementia was actually never really clear as to what it was that ultimately caused the underlying caused the symptoms. And I think that the reason we're at a transformative point in the history of Alzheimer's disease is because we understand a lot more about the biology than we ever have. And based on that biology, we're actually now able to very accurately diagnose Alzheimer's disease, which is a subset of dementia. And when you start to hone in on the underlying biological causes of Alzheimer's disease, now you have a powerful set of tools available to start intervening and applying treatments that ultimately will prove effective for treating. And I think as many people in the audience here today know, there's been a lot of discussion over the last several years with some of the therapeutic innovations, and C2N has been a key part of some of those drug development efforts where we've supported those organizations and academic researchers, industry colleagues who have been developing these therapies, and we can apply our diagnostic tools to really provide a precise, accurate diagnosis, and then also apply the tools to be able to track a biological treatment response. So now you've got a tool that can diagnose the disease. We have ways to start thinking about monitoring the progression of the disease with these precise biomarkers. And then we can ultimately start thinking about how do we intervene before people even display the earliest signs of symptoms. And that's going to come from the biological biomarkers that we can measure today and in the future. And I think it will absolutely change the trajectory of future Alzheimer's disease, where it goes from a condition that is obviously progressive, very serious, and ultimately life-threatening, to one where maybe we can turn it into a chronic, manageable disease, just like many other chronic conditions like diabetes or heart failure, or even some forms of cancer, where the narrative changes dramatically, and we can keep people much more independent than ever, and ultimately be able to have meaningful function in their lives and the ability to spend time with loved ones and friends.
Yeah, and I think, obviously the work you all do is so complex, but when I think about how I'm going to describe to my family what C2N does, you've developed, it's not a drug, it's a blood test. And that blood test is an alternative diagnostic tool, because the others that are out there right now are, they're pretty intense. I mean, maybe you can talk about what those alternatives are, like a PET scan or a spinal tap. And so this becomes such an important tool that so many more people can benefit from. Do I have that right?
Yeah, you do. There's a lot to that narrative, and we can talk all day about the progress and the ways in which we're now diagnosing disease. But I think as you touched upon, like unfortunately, the current clinical standard of care, and it's radically changing as these new tools become available, historically has been clinical evaluation. So clinicians evaluate an individual who's presenting with cognitive concerns, and then based on a whole variety of neuropsychological tests, they can then determine that the person has, in fact, some kind of cognitive impairment. Then the question is, what's the specific underlying cause of the cognitive impairment? And if you think about, you'd say, well, we have amyloid PET scans, we have other imaging modalities, we have cerebral spinal fluid analysis, these lumbar punctures. They can actually provide a lot of insights into the biology of the disease. But as you touched upon, they actually logistically very complicated for patients. So as an example, amyloid PET or PET imaging capabilities are really focused on a presence within the specialized centers throughout the United States and elsewhere throughout the world. So what that means is, like, take the United States as an example. There's 60 million people who live in rural areas and do not have access to these specialized facilities. So they don't even have an option to be able to get an imaging modality like amyloid PET. Or take cerebral spinal fluid analysis. It typically requires a lumbar puncture, which is a needle that goes into the back. And it's a well-tolerated procedure. But many patients, when they hear about that kind of procedural requirement, obviously have a different kind of preference to be able to receive something much easier. And so you would say, well, these tools have been around for better part of a decade, and they're really only used in a very small percentage of people. So the current standard is for north of 75 to 80% of people, they never get anything more than a clinical evaluation. Even among the people that are getting the specialized tools like lumbar puncture, CSF analysis, or imaging, amyloid imaging, you're still only talking about single digit percentages. And so the question is, how do we take such a common condition and one that impacts all elements of a person's lives and is obviously complex and requires a lot of medical care? How do you improve the precision and accuracy of that diagnosis? That's where the attraction to a simple blood test comes into play. And so this is, of course, a vision that C2N has had for close to 20 years. And people used to ask me in the early days, they say, well, you do these complex biomarker measurements. And back then we were using cerebral spinal fluid analysis, and we were trying to understand how these proteins in the brain that are implicated in Alzheimer's disease go awry. And can we develop methods to measure them? Back in the day, the question would be like, well, you have this cerebral spinal fluid analysis, but it's complex. And how do you really ultimately believe you can deliver this to many patients? And we said, one day we will be able to get to blood. And we think that as the analytical techniques that exist in laboratories gets more and more sophisticated, our knowledge of the disease improves, and the methods that we use to pull out these important biomarkers matures, we will have that opportunity. Fast forward 10, 15 years, we introduced the first blood test for help in clinical care for Alzheimer's disease evaluation back in 2020. And since then, it's been a flood of innovation. We've continued to innovate, and the technology's only gotten better. So it's an extremely exciting last 5 years.
That's incredible. I can only imagine what that feels like to be part of that over the last 2 decades, and that innovation that came out of Washington University, commercializing it, and then you mentioned over the last 5 years in particular. So here's what I want to ask you about that. In your role, you have to influence a lot of different types of stakeholders to make sure they're aware of this, because you can have a great innovation, but obviously if people don't know about it, people don't use it, it's not going to be a commercial success and benefit patients the way you hope. So on one hand, you have doctors and scientists that you need to influence, but then you also have to influence patients, because patients need to know why this is important, and you want them to ask for it. So can you talk about what is different about influencing these different groups, and what's the same maybe about reaching doctors and reaching patients?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And of course, managing C2N Diagnostics, we have a lot of different stakeholders. Our primary stakeholder is the patient and the family, right, who's dealing with a complex condition. And so it's a common thread throughout our entire organization and the clinicians that we work with. There's a genuine commitment and interest to try to take advantage of where technology is today to be able to apply it in a way that simplifies the patient's journey, and recognizing a very difficult situation on a very personal level, and say, how can we turn that into something that is manageable and compassionate? And so I think that there's a common language for both the clinician and the patient, in that, like, at the end of the day, we're all like personally touched by this condition. Virtually everyone in C2N Diagnostics has some kind of personal story. And most people you talk to have a personal story with a loved one or a friend who experienced dementia, and then Alzheimer's disease in particular. And so I think that it is a common language between the clinicians and the patients that first and foremost, we're trying to figure out a way to address a very serious medical condition. I think that there's different levels of technical jargon that you can get into when you communicate what it is that you have. And so this is something that does require a balancing act. One thing that we can say with the advent of more information accessible to consumers, patients are very well informed. And in fact, we find sometimes that some of the individuals that are driving demand of our testing capabilities is actually coming from the public and the patients or family members. So family members have these new tools available to them to be able to go onto the internet. There's all kinds of different sources of information. And then they're avid readers of healthcare information. And so what happens is they wind up being really educated. And then they go to their clinicians and they say, hey, doctor, I've learned about this new test. Can you help me understand it? And oftentimes, they've already done research on it and they can easily access publications, perhaps, where they can actually look at some of the scientific details. I think that one of the things that we learned with COVID was that, a lot of people were thirsty for medical information and what was accurate. And so people became very avid readers of all the emerging news. And I think that it's something similar with Alzheimer's disease today because of all the innovation that's occurring. There's a lot of PR around coming from advocacy organizations, from companies that are developing new therapies and new diagnostic tools, and the clinicians themselves who are involved in the cutting edge research to inform about what's happening. So that helps to elevate the conversation. And then, of course, the clinicians, will have a very careful eye on, if I'm going to bring this technology into my clinic, I want to be sure that it's accurate, that it's robust, that it's something I can rely upon when I'm facing a patient who's now coming to me with a concern. And I have to figure out a way to, solve this mystery of what's causing the condition. And so I think that, one of the things that I've gained experience with over many years at this point is communicating with multiple different stakeholders. It's one of the challenges, but also an opportunity. And it's one of the exciting things about the job to be able to communicate with not only the patients, physicians, but also makers. Policymakers are very much paying attention to Alzheimer's disease. We know it's extremely expensive. And so you have insurance companies that are thinking about how do we ensure adequate access for patients to these new technologies? And these are all complex issues that at a societal level we need to work through. And, it's one of the things that is really important to me to have good communication.
Yeah, and I know that in terms of reaching doctors, reaching clinicians, you really emphasized data and research and studies. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about that, because I suspect while it's great that consumers, any of us, can go on and ask, Dr. Google for answers to our questions, it also probably leads to a lot of patients coming into their doctors and sharing ideas or things where the doctors say, oh boy, this is not good. And so you obviously want to make sure if a patient goes to their doctor and maybe it's the first time they've ever heard about your blood test, that it's paired with the right information. So the doctor says, oh, actually, this is really, this is great. I'm so happy to have learned about that. So can you maybe share a little bit more about what does a doctor prioritize when you're trying to influence them that's different from what a patient may prioritize?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And we touched a little bit upon it in the last part of the discussion. But the doctors are very interested in understanding, okay, well, here's a new tool that might be accessible to me. And clinicians in general, by inherent nature, need to be conservative because the time to experiment, if you will, is not when the patient is coming to you with a clinical concern. It's to say, I feel like what I'm doing for the patient has solid scientific foundational principles, and I can even have a mechanism to evaluate the science myself. So, one of the core attributes of going through medical education is that I think clinicians are taught a methodology to be able to evaluate the strength of evidence. And what you need to do is be able to provide that information in a transparent way so that, in fact, they can go to relied upon resources to be able to get that information. And so part of the underlying culture at C2N Diagnostics is to be very transparent. We are very transparent and we're evidence driven. And part of that comes from our historical beginnings, where the company was, as you indicated, founded by two clinicians out of the Washington University School of Medicine, Dr. Randy Bateman, Dr. David Holtzman, both professors at Washington University in the neurology department. And they have spent their entire career thinking about the biology of Alzheimer's disease, but also like, how do you apply that to the concern at the bedside? And when I came in with another colleague, Alana Fogelman, we both came in as clinicians looking at it from the clinical perspective. And we said, well, if we're going to, let's first identify what the clinical problem is. And once we identify the clinical problem, how do we find a solution? And then lo and behold, there's some very advanced technology platforms. We rely on mass spectrometry, which is a very powerful research tool and also a very unique clinical diagnostic tool that is one of the most rapid areas of clinical medicine in diagnostics. The utility of mass spectrometry, because it is such a powerful tool, really recognizes the gold standard for protein quantitation, and what we measure are protein fragments in the blood. And so using this mass spectrometry-based approach, it's rooted in very deep science. And then we say, well, now we've identified mass spectrometry as a unique platform to be able to leverage for developing an important diagnostic test. Now, what is the clinical solution we're trying to address? And so we can develop the biomarkers to be able to address that problem. And then as part of that, like you said, this huge commitment to publishing the data as we develop these tests. And so C2N has really been at the forefront of leading edge publications. We work with clinicians and scientists throughout the entire world. At this point, C2N has been involved in over 150 global studies, and we have dozens of active collaborations throughout the US and outside the US. And each one of those studies are addressed at trying to answer an important question about the disease and how we can better diagnose and manage the disease. And so with every single study, in our firm commitment to evidence generation, we learn something new. That those new learnings get translated to ultimate patient benefit. And that's what we're about at C2N Diagnostics. So the culture here is one that's very science driven. And I think that's put us into a position where a lot of collaborators and stakeholders do trust what we do. And it's really fundamental to everything that we do at C2N Diagnostics.
It's just incredible to hear about all of the collaborations and the studies and the testing that goes into something like this. You know, as somebody on the outside who doesn't know this world, and how obviously it's a perfect case study of understanding what matters to your audience. In this case, we're talking about the clinicians, and then really focusing on those things that make sure that this works, but that also is going to motivate them. And I'm wondering, on the other side, what do you say to a patient who says, well, why do I even want to know if I have this incurable disease?
Well, I think that's a lengthy discussion, and I think it's a very active discussion. And historically, I think there was some general inertia or ambivalence to having the specific diagnosis. Maybe this was a couple of decades ago. And over the last couple of decades, as we've learned more about the disease, we say, well, wait a minute, there is a benefit to knowing. In multiple studies, we've been able to demonstrate that at the earliest stages of cognitive concern, that being a person with early memory, true memory concerns, you can have a clinical misdiagnosis rate between 25 and 50%. So 1 in 4 to 1 in 2 people are being misdiagnosed in the early stages of clinical presentation. That's an extraordinary number when you think about it. And then you say, to have a misdiagnosis or misclassification, then think about all the downstream implications of having that incorrect diagnosis. It can lead to inappropriate use of medications. Many medications have a risk-benefit profile. And then if you don't have the right therapies that are being applied to the condition, then really all you're doing is introducing a risk to the patient, because they're just being exposed to the side effects without the potential benefits of being on the right drug. So there's, one can get a precise diagnosis and then improve the utilization of medications. The other thing is, from a personal perspective, it allows people to better plan for the future. And whether that's financial planning, or whether it's thinking about the way in which one wants to spend their time with loved ones, and where they put their energy, right? Everyone wants to have an impact. And the question is, like, when you understand that you have a certain condition, that can certainly have a big impact as to how you plan your future. And we've seen that. The other point is that, maybe much more concrete, is that we now have treatments that are emerging that are specifically designed around molecules or mediators of Alzheimer's disease. And in that case, one needs to have a very precise, accurate diagnosis, because that's the only way in which someone's going to be able to get on a drug, which has now been proven in multiple clinical studies that you can actually start to change the trajectory of Alzheimer's disease. And what's really important there is that we know that the time to diagnosis is a critically important variable, which means the longer a person delays in getting that diagnosis when a problem starts, that's delaying their opportunity to get access to a drug. And in fact, some of these drugs, the way in which the clinicians think about it in terms of the appropriateness for the patient to receive a drug, are saying that once the patient is too far advanced, then they're no longer a candidate for the drug. And so I think that puts a very strong onus on the clinicians, the healthcare system, to think about mechanisms by which we can get earlier diagnosis done more accurately and more timely. And then what does it do? I think that there's a liberating moment for a lot of patients. And I've talked to many patients, I've talked to many clinicians. The reason why they're so excited and feel it's such an important priority for patients to have this information is, first of all, patients are entitled to know, right? And patients are being much more proactive and taking it upon themselves and their loved ones to be proactive in their health. And that includes having the most information. When I was doing training back in my days of practicing cardiology, and I was on faculty at Johns Hopkins, one of the things that was of keen academic interest to me was trying to understand variability in care. It turns out that one of the ways in which you drive the worst outcomes in healthcare is varying the care patterns without focusing on things that we know works. So by reducing that variation in care, you improve outcomes. And along that, there is really not a medical condition that I know of where patients don't do better in their health journey when they're more informed compared to when they're less informed. So more information is power. And then it creates some options for how to manage going forward.
Well, and I think it's such an important reminder. I mean, something you said there, which is 20 years ago, there weren't a lot of treatment options that anybody could even consider for this particular disease. And now there are. And so you started, developing the technology for this test when like your investor said, back when it was boring, meaning, great, what would you do with it? And now there's a lot of innovation happening in the field. So it's really important. It creates those options, but I hadn't thought about some of those others that are so important about, the planning and so that's.
I would say one other point, which is there's been a lot of data presented about the benefits of healthy lifestyle living insofar as it relates to cardiovascular health or metabolic health. And Alzheimer's disease is no different. So we have very strong evidence, really has merged over the last 5-10 years as the data has gotten stronger. Some very compelling studies that show unequivocally you can actually delay the onset of Alzheimer's disease, or you can slow its progression by adopting healthy lifestyle behavior. So if in fact more information can be an incentive and motivator for people to change their lifestyle, to be doing things that we know are good for the heart, are also good for the brain, like exercise, good diet, sleep. Sleep is critically important. When you think about sleep, you say, here's a little tangent. Sorry, I like to go off on tangents. So when you think about sleep, it is the one mechanism you have to rest your brain. It is the most metabolically active tissue organ in the entire body. And so having 6 to 8 hours of sleep, like you want to make sure you have adequate sleep, right? And so we've had a lot of data emerge to show that, in fact, people that are at higher risk of Alzheimer's disease may in fact have chronic sleep deprivation. And so I think that, we want to embrace, again, healthy lifestyle habits, adequate sleep. When we go exercise our muscles, we think about resting them, right? Same way, the brain is no different. So with rest comes good brain health.
Yeah. Wow. So I guess I'm wondering, when I think about the benefits of, this blood test, for example, I can only imagine that you have to grapple with some kind of language and messaging issues. You have maybe lawyers and experts on one side that I suspect are necessarily so very careful about how you describe the importance of this test and the benefits. And then, on the other side, you have people marketing this and making sure patients know about it, maybe patient advocates that see how it could improve, the lives of people. And, they might want to use the most compelling language possible. So, because it's hard to break through in this world. How do you, as the leader of the company, as the CEO, help your team find the right balance when, because I think, not even in healthcare, every leader probably faces those similar challenges. You got the lawyers versus the marketers is a pretty typical one.
Absolutely. And I think that, at the end of the day, we're dealing with patients' lives. So I think it all starts with a high moral integrity and moral fiber. And I think that is culturally something that is critically important at C2N Diagnostics. So this moral fiber permeates throughout all elements of the organization, right? So that includes commercial, that includes marketing, that includes legal, that includes compliance, it includes quality and the way in which we innovate with R&D. And so I think that, yes, it is a balancing act. At the end of the day, the truth always reveals itself with enough time, right? And so I think that, we take the responsibility of what we're doing very seriously. And so we know that, again, it's important for us to, because this is such a unique innovation, the Percivity-AD2 test is a test that we introduced about 6 months ago. And people said, well, boy, how well can I trust that data, right? And so that comes from, again, rooted in our culture to say, like, let's back it up with the evidence. Let's put the tests in the hands of the leading researchers throughout to let them determine whether it's a technology or a testing tool that is something that should be used in clinical care. And I think that kind of check and balance, where the investigators are committed to working with us to make sure that we understand the promises and the pitfalls of the technology, that we understand it, and we ultimately have to communicate that. So I think that, coming back to your question, it is something that we manage carefully, but I think at the end of the day, we can sleep well at night knowing that, we have a very high moral fiber and we take what we report very responsibly. And we know that as a company that really has been at the forefront of this whole field of blood biomarkers, that if we don't do it right, then we really risk causing concerns for the rest of the industry, broad trust issues from patients, clinicians, as to say, well, why should I adopt this technology or any technology that might be related to what C2N Diagnostics does? Because there are other groups working on other blood tests. And I think that as a group who has really been one of the trailblazers, we know that there's a big responsibility for us, but we embrace it because I think it's like we know how good our technology is. And we say, like, if we can even elevate quality for the rest of the field, that's great.
I really I think it's so important to hear what you said about the moral fiber and just thinking about sort of the ethical approach, because, as a leader, what I'm hearing from you is you have to establish what those values are for the company, what the culture is all about. And then, lawyers are going to look at the world through their lens and their expertise, and marketers and PR people are going to look at the world through their lens and their expertise. but those values that really bind the whole organization together and guide everyone, those are really important. And if you establish those and make that clear, you're focused on the patient, we really need to build trust, and maintain that moral fiber, then it can help you resolve some of those, natural
Inherent
differences.
conflicts. Yeah.
Yeah,
Inherent challenges.
inherent conflicts. I mean, you want those types of conflicts, right? You have to have a little bit of those to get to where you want to go. So I love hearing that. I wanted to ask you, kind of to switch gears here for a second, thinking about just different technology tools that leaders use. I've noticed that many doctors are not on LinkedIn, or at least not very active. But I've noticed that you, not just through the company page, but you personally through Dr. Joel Braunstein's LinkedIn page, you've chosen that as one of the channels that you use to reach your professional network and make sure people understand, the business side of what's going on. And often there's great news about the new test, the Percivity AD2, or raising capital or other things. And so I wonder if you could just speak a little bit about that, because I know it's becoming more popular with a lot of leaders, but at the same time, some are they can be a bit skeptical. And so why have you decided that LinkedIn is a channel that it makes sense for you to use?
Yeah, that's a great question. I certainly don't proclaim to be a social media expert. I'm constantly reminded of that by my children. And I think that the way I look at LinkedIn and other media outlets is that it represents another conduit and channel for you to communicate what you're excited and confident about. And so I think that LinkedIn happens to be a strong professional network. And we know that a lot of our clinician colleagues that we work with are on LinkedIn. We work with many industry collaborators and foundations, and they have a presence. And so I think that it does represent a unique conduit for being able to communicate encouraging progress. And a lot of groups are interested in that progress, right? I mean, people are really thirsty for information. And one of the things that we find when we go to these medical meetings nowadays, thousands of people there. I mean, you have blood biomarkers consuming almost like 50% of the conference. And so it's a very active topic. But then the question is, like, when you're doing something unique and you have milestones that you're able to report, like, what's the most effective way to be able to communicate that to your professional network? And LinkedIn has been a good resource for that.
That's great. Yeah, I think about, you can only go to so many conferences in person, right? And LinkedIn becomes sort of another layer where you can have those touch points. And then when you see people, they might already have heard of some of that great news, and you can build on that, and it can support your partnership. So I'm a big LinkedIn advocate. So I love it when CEOs see that it's a good channel. Well, last thing I want to ask you before we wrap up today, Joel, is just, I'm curious, where outside of the field of medicine and technology do you find inspiration that might have an impact on how you show up as a leader and how you influence others?
No, it's great. It's a great, very thoughtful question. I spend a lot of time working, but it's partially underscored by my passion for what we're doing, and the excitement and the ability to have a real impact on patients globally. We really feel at C2N Diagnostics that we're having that impact. But at the same time, there can be stress in the job. And so it's nice to have periodic outlets. I certainly enjoy spending time with family and friends. And that's, really the strongest asset that I have, to have a very supportive family and able to spend quality time with them whenever time permits. And then also thinking, like, what are those outlets to relieve that stress and apply. I tend to have an analytical mindset and maybe a little less promotional. My analytical approach to things, intellectualizing things, to say, well, what kind of hobby could be conducive to that? And so one of my passions outside of medicine and managing C2N Diagnostics is actually photography. And so I'm an avid landscape and wildlife photographer. To me, being out in nature and seeing the world around you through a unique lens and having that surrounding peace and knowing how much is happening in the world and how much radical change is occurring. To think about like looking at, let's say, the Merced River at Yosemite National Park, it brings an incredible sense of calm and peace. And then you take a picture through a carefully composed image, and now all of a sudden it becomes an imprint on your mind. And when you look at that image, let's say 2 years from the moment that you took it, it actually takes you back to a time where you felt that peace. And what's amazing is I've actually found that there's quite a number of clinicians and scientists and colleagues throughout industry who are also avid photographers. I don't know if it's because it can be an analytical type hobby where you can get into, all the different elements of aperture and light and shutter speed. But I think that what you find is it's an outlet that people find peace in. And so what's funny is I go to some of these meetings, and there's a fairly large group of people that I know within the Alzheimer's disease space that turns out they're avid photographers as well. And so we compare notes. I was sitting down with a leading researcher in Alzheimer's disease, and we were talking about birding. And he says, "Oh my gosh, I love birding." And then we started comparing pictures. And then before we know it, we're both going out birding together. And so it's a great opportunity to be able to connect with people and find a common thread outside of work, which can be fairly intense.
What just strikes me about that hobby, and I hadn't thought about it before, but photography is all about capturing a memory, and then when I think about, the company that you lead, you're helping people capture and maintain those memories. And that's really the heart of what you're doing. So it seems like a very appropriate hobby for you.
That's great. Thank you. Yes.
Well, Joel, this has been such a great conversation. I am so grateful that you took time out of your busy schedule to speak with us, because the innovative work that you all are doing is just so impressive. And, explaining it down for a layperson like me, not everyone can do that. So I really appreciate you doing that. What the blood test has done, the alternative it's provided for folks, is pretty incredible. So C2N Diagnostics is making history, and I know you will continue to. And I just want to say thank you for spending time with us today.
Anthony, thanks so much. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Chief Influencer, a production of Social Driver and the Communications Board. If you know a leader who should be featured as a Chief Influencer, please nominate them at chiefinfluencer.org. For show notes and more, visit us at chiefinfluencer.org or follow Chief Influencer on LinkedIn. Until next time.